Hi everybody, so this is a bit of a different video. I do want to share a recipe for salted egg shortbread, but I also want to share a review for using Becel baking sticks, which I was sent a sample of a couple weeks ago. So I'll mainly be talking about how it compares to butter in this recipe. For this recipe, we're going to use the whole stick, which is equivalent to half a cup of whatever fat you're using, or a whole stick of butter, or half a cup of butter. Normally, if you're using butter, you have to leave it at room temperature for quite a while for it to be soft enough to stir. With the Becel baking sticks, I've taken this out of the fridge maybe a couple minutes ago and it's still pretty firm and cool, but stirring it for a couple more minutes is softened up quite readily. But the downside is that with creaming, which is stirring vigorously to incorporate air like this, it doesn't hold as much air as butter does. When you finish stirring your baking fat, you can add the icing sugar, salt, and vanilla paste or vanilla extract, and then stir that in as well. With the baking sticks, I find that you don't really know when you finish stirring, because with butter, you finish stirring when it turns from a darker yellow color to a lighter yellow color, and that's because you've incorporated air into the butter mixture. But with these baking sticks, I find that it's really hard to cream air into it. So if you're substituting, I would definitely make sure to add some baking powder. The next ingredient is salted egg yolks. Now, I talked about these in one of my previous recipes for runny yolk buns, but they're duck eggs that have been preserved in salt and like some rice wine and mud mixture for at least 40 days, and they're very flavorful. So I'm going to add 2 salted egg yolks to the recipe and just mashing them up before I add them to the mixture. I also wanted a bit of tenderness from a regular egg yolk, so I'm adding 1 large egg yolk as well. And this one you just stir in, you don't have to hard boil beforehand. Another thing I found different about working with the Becel baking sticks is that it doesn't continue to soften as it sits at room temperature, whereas with butter or margarine, as it continues to sit at room temperature, it tends to get softer and softer. And for the baking sticks, it just kind of remains this soft, pliable, semi-cold margarine texture throughout the whole process. So it definitely makes the dough more stable and easier to work with, and I think this will be very helpful, especially if you're baking with kids, because you can play around with the dough a bit more without changing the texture. The main fat content in the Becel baking sticks is canola oil and palm oil, but it also has a bit of water content and some milk ingredients, which makes working with this a lot more similar to working with butter compared to shortening. Once everything is well mixed together, sift in your pastry flour and a bit of baking powder. And as I mentioned, it is important to add a bit of baking powder, which is not always added to shortbread recipes, because we probably didn't incorporate as much air as we usually would in the initial creaming stage. The color of the dough and also the finished product is quite similar to using butter, and that's because they do add a bit of beta carotene for coloring. At this stage, if you want crispier cookies, you can add 2 teaspoons or 10 grams of milk. Otherwise, if you like your cookies more tender and crumbly, you can just add them to the piping bag. Fit it with a large round star tip, so my tip is about 1 centimeter in diameter with spikes on it for stars. Then I only added half of the dough in because for the other half I wanted to add some cocoa powder and just do some recipe testing. I do apologize for the flashy wavy lights throughout the video. I have cheap lighting in my place that don't quite agree with my camera. So I'm just piping rosettes. They're about 3 centimeters wide and I'm leaving about 2 centimeters between each one. And here I do find another benefit from using the Becel sticks, in that if I were to use butter, the heat of my hands on the side of the piping bag will start melting the dough, so that by the last cookie that I pipe, it'll get all soft and kind of gross, whereas with the baking sticks, it doesn't happen, and the last cookie still keeps its shape. So I also did some recipe testing, and as an alternate flavor, you can add 30 grams of cocoa powder with about 15 grams of milk, or about a tablespoon of milk. And these cookies come out a little bit crispier because of the extra water content, and the salted egg and chocolate flavors kind of go together interestingly. So these just have to go into the fridge to firm up for about 10 minutes while you preheat the oven to 350 Fahrenheit or 176 degrees Celsius. So this is how they look like coming out of the oven. The texture is nice and crumbly. Flavor-wise, disappointingly, it didn't taste buttery at all. Actually, when I first opened the package from the fridge, it smelled like butter popcorn, so I think they do add butter flavoring to it, but after baking, it didn't have any of the butter flavor left. So my conclusion is that even though butter is a bit more finicky to work with, unless I have special reasons that I need a pliable, easy to work with dough, I'll probably still choose to use butter when I make this recipe again. So thank you so much for watching. Feel free to check out my Instagram for more baking related stories, and I'll see you next time. Bye!